Aside from a small handful of events, like the first vision, the translation of the Book of Mormon, and the restoration of priesthood keys, it is possible that what happened in Nauvoo on August 8, 1844, was the most critical, pivotal moment in our history, forever shaping the trajectory of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This was the day church members in Nauvoo voted on who would lead the church following the deaths of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. And the stakes could not have been higher as they decided between Joseph's first counselor, Sidney Rigdon, on the one hand, and the 12 apostles led by Brigham Young on the other. Because the choice at hand was not just about who would lead the church, but ultimately about what kind of church it would be. Would the church hold on to and perpetuate the Nauvoo doctrines and practices, or abandon them in favor of returning to a more Kirtland or even Fayette-era type church? With this vote, the future of the church hung in the balance. On today's episode of Church History Matters, we walk through the 6 days in August, leading up to and including this meeting of August 8th. And we weigh into the controversy about whether or not God actually transfigured Brigham Young in front of the crowd to make him look and sound like Joseph Smith. I'm Scott Woodward, and my co-host is Casey Griffiths. And today, Casey and I dive into our third episode in this series about succession in the presidency. Now let's get into it.
Hello, Scott.
Hello, Casey.
Here we are once again talking about succession.
Yes.
And we've got a lot to talk about today. Many, many things to discuss.
Juicy episode with so much we were just talking about before we pushed record. So much we think our listeners are going to love in this one because the history is rich and consequential at the same time. And so,
yeah,
super important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, we're going to put a plug in again to say we're going to be at Education Week at BYU.
Yeah.
What are the dates there again?
Education Week is August 19th to the 23rd.
19th through the 23rd.
Yes, 2024.
We're in the Wilkinson Center Ballroom.
Yeah.
And we're doing our series on good thinking. So we're going to be talking a little bit about good thinking in church history and doctrine, which was a series we did a little while ago. It was a ton of fun. And so we hope you'll join us there.
Yeah. We get email feedback from time to time from you listeners, and we love it. That is wonderful, but it would be even an extra cherry on top to actually get to meet you in person. And so if you are in the neighborhood and you want to come by, just say hi. That would be great. If you want to come and listen to our class, that would be even better, but we would love to meet you. So swing on by.
Yeah. So 1:50 to 2:45 p.m. in the Wilkinson Center Ballroom.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm doing a solo series Tuesday through Friday at 9:50. That's in the Jesse Knight building. And then I'm doing a class on Monday at 9:50 also. That'll be in the Wilk. So we'd love to meet you in person. We'd love to get your feedback. Come see us at Education Week.
100%. You're doing 3, Casey? You are an overachiever. Have you always been an overachiever, do you feel like?
No, I'm not an overachiever, Scott. I'm just as lazy as I've always been. So I just like doing Education Week. It's kind of fun. I get to teach.
It is fun.
Young adults. It's nice to teach adults. It's fun.
Yeah. Have a little variety from young adults to adults.
That's right. Grown people. So we've got a lot to talk about. So let's jump into it. We've ended our series on the martyrdom, and we're talking about succession in the presidency.
Yeah.
And the most dramatic instance of succession in the presidency is Brigham Young.
Yes.
In fact, do you want to give us kind of a recap where we've gone so far in the first 2 episodes?
Yes, I do. We've been talking about the aftermath of the murders of Joseph and Hyrum Smith that occurred on June 27th, 1844. This totally rocked the church in lots of ways, not just the pain of the loss of their beloved prophet and assistant president of the church, but also a fear and uncertainty about where to go from here, right? And so in our first episode, we talked about 8 possible paths for succession in the wake of the murders of Joseph and Hyrum. And all 8 of these paths, Casey, were either explicitly delineated by Joseph or Revelation, or were viewed as plausible interpretations of statements Joseph had made or actions he had took. So these are all like Joseph Smith-based potential paths for succession. 8's a big number when you think about succession paths, right? Talk about confusing. And so, in no particular order, here they are real quick again. If you want to go in more detail, go back to the first episode. But here are the 8 paths. Number 1, succession by a counselor in the first presidency. Okay. That would be Sidney Rigdon's claim. We'll talk more about that today. Number 2, succession through a special appointment. That was the claim of James Strang, Lyman White, and Alpheus Cutler, based on the precedent of David Whitmer being appointed to succeed Joseph in case he ever became a fallen prophet.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, a succession through the office of associate president. That's Hyrum Smith and Oliver Cowdery. That office dies with Hyrum Smith. Number 4, succession by the presiding patriarch. That's also a position that basically dies with Hyrum Smith, although William Smith tried to weasel in through that path.
Mm-hmm.
Number 5, succession by the Council of 50. Number 6, succession by the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. This is the claim of Brigham Young and the 12, which we'll talk more about today. Number 7, succession by 3 priesthood councils, where not only is the Quorum of the 12 equal in authority and power to the first presidency, but so is the Quorum of the 70 and the standing high councils of the stakes of Zion. And nobody actually appealed to this in terms of the 70, but there was an appeal in terms of the presiding high councils of the stakes of Zion by none other than Emma Smith. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then number 8, and finally, is succession by a descendant of Joseph Smith. This is the claim for the Community of Christ today, which was initially the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ through Joseph Smith III, who was 11 years old at the time of the martyrdom. And so this was no doubt a hope in Joseph Smith's heart that his son would eventually succeed him, but there was no immediate path for succession in terms of at his death, an 11-year-old would lead the church like that. That wasn't in the cards.
Yeah.
So those are the 8 real quick. And each of them represented a pretty tantalizing prospect. But the reality of the situation in 1844 of August is that there were really only 2 serious options for succession at that time. First option was succession by a counselor in the first presidency. That's Sidney Rigdon. And the other was succession by the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, with Brigham Young as its president. And in our last episode, we talked really about the viability of both of these. We really dove into the history of Sidney Rigdon, where he was kind of a shooting star, bright at the beginning, and then he sort of tapered off pretty intensely at the end here. He was very effective in the first season of his assisting Joseph Smith, but after some serious head trauma and other difficulties and trials, his effectiveness starts to wane considerably. And Joseph even tried to get him out of the first presidency, but the church voted him to stay in at Hyrum Smith's proposal. So Joseph got countered, and he says, if you don't throw him off while I'm with you, you're going to have to throw him off when I'm gone, and it's not going to be as easy.
That was prophetic.
That was prophetic. And so anyway, we talked about why Sidney was maybe not the best choice and why the Quorum of the 12 Apostles was more appealing. And so I think we built right up in our last episode to what we want to talk about today.
Yeah.
So we left off last time with Sidney Rigdon on his way back to Nauvoo from Pittsburgh, and other members of the Quorum of the 12 on their way back to Nauvoo from their various points of dispersion as they'd been out stumping for Joseph Smith for presidency. And in some ways, Casey, they were headed back to Nauvoo on something of a collision course. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. There's going to be a showdown.
A showdown.
Yeah.
And so that's what we want to talk about today is the showdown, right?
Yeah. And by the way, we mentioned those 8 methods of succession because each one keeps popping up. Like the main 2 that they considered immediately were succession by counselor. That's going to be Sidney Rigdon, or succession by the 12, which is led by Brigham Young. But I was surprised going through the sources this time that 3 quorums option kept popping up too, mostly because William Marks was really involved in a lot of the sort of maneuvering that happens here. And it appears that Emma Smith really liked William Marks. So she's giving him her support.
And he's the stake president in Nauvoo, correct?
He's the stake president in Nauvoo. And he's actually going to be a big player in setting up what becomes the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known to most people today as Community of Christ. So it seems today like, man, the 12 was just a foregone conclusion, that's what's going to happen. When succession happens in the church today, it's pretty much a well-oiled machine. But in 1844, this was not set down, and there was a lot of anxiety over who was going to lead the church. For instance, James Blakely, who is a church member, He lives just a few miles up from Nauvoo at Rock Island, Illinois. He writes a letter during this time where he says, quote, "The church is left without an earthly head, unless the promise of the Lord shall be fulfilled, which saith that if he remove Joseph, he would appoint another in his stead. But as this has not yet been done, what is the church to do?" Now, sir, if I have been correctly informed, some of the members of the church at Nauvoo want Stephen Markham for their head. That's a name you never hear brought up.
Yeah.
Others want Sidney Rigdon. Others, President Marks. That's William Marks. Others, Little Joseph, meaning Joseph Smith's son. Others, Brigham Young. And others, Parley P. Pratt.
Mm-hmm.
You never hear that name brought up.
No.
And if they can all have their choice, we shall soon have a multiplicity of churches of the Latter-day Saints. That's a letter he writes in August 1844, right around the time that we're going to discuss today. So that leads us to the burning question for today's episode, which is, what caused most of the church, the majority of church members in August 1844, to choose Brigham Young and the 12 as their leader? So we just spoiled the end. You know who gets chosen to lead the church, but there's a lot of stuff that happens leading up to this.
It's a big question.
It's a big question. It's been explored a lot by Latter-day Saint historian. The historian we're using primarily today is Ronald Walker. And Ron Walker passed away a few years ago, but he wrote an amazing piece on the succession crisis called 6 Days in August, Brigham Young and the Succession. It's available for free. Just Google it along with BYU RSC. And you can read the whole thing on its own along with his footnotes, which are extensive and wonderful. There's also been some interesting developments too, because a lot of historians have argued that, history is written by the victors, that we don't get a lot of Sidney Rigdon's side of things. But in the last little while, specifically back in 2015, BYU Studies actually published this article by Robin Jensen and Legine Carruth because they were able to decipher the notes from Sidney Rigdon's speech that he gave to the members of the church. So Thomas Bullock took notes, but he took them in shorthand, and only a handful of people today know how to translate those shorthand notes. And so if you want to read what Sidney Rigdon actually wrote, this article is also available for free online. Sidney Rigdon's Plea to the Saints, transcription of Thomas Bullock's shorthand notes from August 8, 1844. Now, we should also mention, too, that there are some historians that cast doubt, not on Brigham Young's succession, but on whether or not anything miraculous happened when Brigham Young spoke to the saints.
Well, there are those who cast doubt on Brigham Young's succession as well, of course.
I guess there are, but I think everybody kind of agrees that Brigham Young took control.
Oh, yeah.
Whether or not you think he should have or not.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
This historian, and the main historian that argues this is Richard Van Wagener. Richard Van Wagener wrote a biography of Sidney Rigdon, and what he's arguing is that Brigham Young seized control, but there was no miraculous experience associated with Brigham Young's succession, which common story told in the church that Brigham Young was transfigured when he spoke to the saints on August 8th, 1844. Richard Van Wagener says, no, Brigham Young just outmaneuvered Sidney. There was no spiritual experience that happened. And we're going to talk about why he makes that argument. The counter to that is a wonderful article by Lynn Watkins Jorgensen and the staff of BYU Studies, where they went out and searched and collected accounts of people that were there on August 8th, 1844, and they found 129 accounts and counting. It's possible there's more out there. And they published this in the book Opening the Heavens, Account of Divine Manifestations, which, Scott, in course of my research, I was led back to Doctrine and Covenants Central, our website.
Nice.
Where our excellent archivist, Jared Riddick, has actually placed a PDF of this entire book on Doctrine and Covenants Central. So if you go to Doctrine and Covenants Central, you can get Opening the Heavens, Accounts of Divine Manifestations for free.
Bam.
It's an excellent book. And not only does it talk about succession, it has a lot of stuff on Book of Mormon translation. It has a lot of stuff on the first vision and the different accounts of the first vision. It's a great, great resource, and you can get it for free there.
Shout out to Jared Riddick, our favorite archivist.
Go get him, Jared. He's such a good guy. And he's he's constantly talking about the archive, and we want to point people towards the archive because there's a vast array of resources that Jared works diligently to assemble there.
He's done such a good job.
Yeah, Jared's a great member of the team.
Cool. Okay, so those are our sources that we're going to be drawing from today.
Those are our sources, yeah.
All right, so how do we want to start?
Well, I mean, the whole thing happens in 6 days. Sidney Rigdon shows up before Brigham Young gets to Nauvoo.
Uh-huh.
And Ron Walker titled his account of this 6 Days in August.
Yeah.
And so I think we're just going to go through each day one by one.
Yeah.
But before we do that, we've got to kind of set the scene, which we did a lot in the last episode. But now we're going to get into the specifics. So let's dive into it.
Okay, see, we've discussed a lot of important church history events in a lot of different series here on Church History Matters, but it's possible, I'm not saying it's true, but it's possible that what happens in these 6 days could be the most critical 6 days in the history of the church.
Yeah.
Tell me your thoughts on that. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, and we're going to return to this point again and again, but it's not just because of they're deciding who's going to lead the church.
Mm-hmm.
They're deciding what kind of church it's going to be.
That's so big. That's so huge.
That's huge, right? There's a lot of indications that Sidney Rigdon and William Marks specifically wanted to sort of go back to the way things were in Kirtland, or maybe even earlier than that they wanted sort of an earlier version of the church.
Yeah.
Brigham Young and the 12 were committed to the whole set of revelations that had been revealed in Nauvoo, which included a lot of really amazing things like temple work for the dead, a lot of controversial things like plural marriage and eternal marriage and second anointing. And this honestly is the separation point for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that we're part of, and a lot of the 1844 breakoffs like Community of Christ or the Church of Jesus Christ Strangites or the Church of Jesus Christ Bickertonites that sort of believe in an earlier version of the church. So that's what's at stake here too, is everything that's been revealed in Nauvoo and some things that really do separate us from other branches of the Restoration that trace themselves back to Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon.
So it's a bold statement to say that what we're talking about today could be one of the most critical moments in the history of the church, but I think it's defensible. Bold, but defensible because of what you're saying. Yeah, it's not just who leads the church, it's what kind of church will this be?
Yeah.
The who and the what are inextricably tied.
Yeah.
I want to kind of frame it that way. This is a big deal, folks. So
okay,
let's dive into day one then of these 6 days, shall we?
Okay.
So the prelude to these 6 days is this. So Sidney Rigdon had just arrived in Pittsburgh on June 28th, actually, the day after the murder of Joseph and Hyrum. Okay, he didn't know about it then because news traveled way, way slower back in those days. But within a week, Elder Jedediah M. Grant sent Sidney an extra edition of the Nauvoo Neighbor, which detailed the murders and then followed up with a personal visit to Sidney. At first, Sidney said he wanted to work with the 12 to figure out the course forward. But other than John Taylor and Willard Richards, the 12 at that time were scattered throughout the United States, engaged in what they called stumping for Joseph's presidential campaign, out promoting Joseph for president. And Sidney at first asked the apostles to actually join him in Pittsburgh on their way back to Nauvoo, but Brigham Young declined, telling Sidney that he wanted to get back to Nauvoo as quickly as possible. And there are some indications in their letters back and forth that they both recognized a brewing controversy of succession, and they're already wary of each other, it seems. And so while Brigham Young gathers the apostles, Sidney sets out beeline for Nauvoo, where he arrives on August 2nd, 1844. That's kind of the prelude, right? So the 12 are on their way. Sidney beelines it. He beats the 12 there. What happens next, Casey?
Yeah, so Sidney gets to Nauvoo before Brigham Young, but not before all the apostles. Remember,
good point.
There's 2 apostles that are in Nauvoo.
Yes.
One of them's John Taylor, who's really badly wounded from Carthage jail. The other one is Willard Richards, who basically, for the 5 weeks when they're getting everybody back to Nauvoo, leads the community there. He even signed some of his letters acting president during this time. But Sidney makes it before Brigham does. When he gets there, however, 2 more apostles have made it to Nauvoo. That's Parley P. Pratt and George A. Smith.
Yeah.
Parley and Sidney have this long relationship going back. Even before either one of them were members of the church, they knew each other. They were preachers in Ohio. And so when Parley hears that Sidney Rigdon has arrived in town, he goes and he finds Sidney at basically to try and get these meetings going. Let's discuss what we're going to do. Sidney, however, according to Parley, was surrounded by kind of well-wishers, people shaking his hand. welcoming back. Good to see you. So Parley actually kind of defers and says, "You're busy today. We will not interrupt you today, but tomorrow morning, the few of the 12 who are here will want to meet with you and sit down and counsel together." And they agree. The next morning, they're going to meet at John Taylor's home at 8 a.m. This is going to be Sunday. And actually, John Taylor's home becomes sort of like home base for the apostles. And the reason primarily is John Taylor isn't very mobile at this point.
Less mobile.
Yeah, so they're deferring to him. They're coming to his home because it's really, really still hard for him to get up and about with the wounds he's had in Carthage. So that's just day one. Parley P. Pratt reaches out to Sidney Rigdon, says, "Let's meet tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Let's start conversations and start talking things over." That's day one, August 3rd. So day two.
Day two of the succession crisis. Sunday, August 4th, 1844. The apostles in Nauvoo assembled at John Taylor's home. Those apostles who were in Nauvoo, those four you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Those four, yeah.
And Sidney had agreed to meet them, but he doesn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
So they send Parley out to go seek him out, and Parley finds him out talking to a neighbor not far from John Taylor's home. Parley thought the conversation was aimless. He says, he's like, "Sidney, come on, come to the meeting." But Sidney refused to be pulled away. And so eventually Parley was able to pull Sidney away from the conversation. But then Sidney says, "You know what? I have to be somewhere else." He produces another excuse here. He said that a large crowd was gathering and Sidney wanted to preach to them. And so he does not come to John Taylor's home. Parley felt the apostles were left to, he says, do their own counseling. And he felt that Sidney had deliberately avoided meeting with them. He felt snubbed. Mm-hmm. But it's actually true that Sidney actually goes and preaches to a crowd. Some sources talk about the crowd being quite large. Sidney chose a text from Isaiah 55:9, the line that says, "My ways are higher than your ways." And it's to that crowd that he announced that he had received something of an extraordinary vision while in the upper room of his lodging in Pittsburgh. He said, he announced some strange things, actually, Casey. Here's one. He announced that, quote, "He was the identical man that the ancient prophets had sung about, wrote and rejoiced over, and that he was sent to do the identical work that had been the theme of all the prophets in every preceding generation," close quote. That's weird. I actually remember Parley P. Pratt quipping that he was the man, speaking of himself, Parley P. Pratt, he said, "I am the man that no prophets have ever talked about." That's what that was his quip. Anyway, William Clayton, who was there in that meeting, reported that Sidney, quote, "related a vision which the Lord had shown him concerning the situation of the church, and said there must be a guardian appointed to build the church up to Joseph as he has begun it," close quote. Others remember Sidney saying that he had seen Joseph in the heavens and said that he, Sidney, now held the keys of this dispensation. One report of the sermon says that Rigdon told the crowd that he would now stand as a god to the people, like Moses, and he would preserve the church as Joseph had begun it. There's some other interesting things.
Yeah, can I talk about this? This is my favorite part. Orson Hyde records this, but Sidney Rigdon had a real kind of like fixation on like the end days and like the bloody end days. And Orson Hyde reports that part of Sidney Rigdon's speech was him talking about like the wars of the last days. And his quote, he said that Sidney Rigdon said, "I am going to fight a real bloody battle with sword and with gun. I will fight the battles of the Lord. I will also cross the Atlantic, encounter the Queen's forces and overcome them, plant the American standard on English ground, and then march to the palace of Her Majesty," this is Queen Victoria, "and demand a portion of her riches and dominions, which if she refuse, I will take the little madam by the nose and lead her out, and she shall have no power to help herself. If I do not do this, the Lord never spake by mortal." Like, whoa.
Oh boy, this is weird.
And he's talking to an audience of mostly British converts.
Oh my gosh.
And Queen Victoria, by the way, was brand new. She'd just barely been coronated while the apostles were actually in England at the time.
Seems so random and like not relevant to the context of August 4th, right? Like it seems so random and nonsensical, really.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. That's my favorite sort of chunk that comes out of this is he's going to lead Queen Victoria by the nose and force her to bow before him. It's
so weird.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, okay. So after this speech on August 4th, Sidney and his allies made another dramatic move. While Elder Charles C. Rich was preaching, he's interrupted by William Marks. So William Marks is totally on Sidney's side here. This is the stake president in Nauvoo. And he declared, interrupting Elder Rich's preaching, he declared that on Thursday morning, August 8th, President Rigdon would hold a special meeting of the saints to consider his claims. Rigdon wanted the question of succession settled within 4 days, basically. And so Rigdon calls for this meeting without consulting any of the members of the 12. Parley P. Pratt, who was in the meeting, tried to challenge William Marks. He asked him to wait until the arrival of all the apostles. Mark said, well, Sidney actually wants to hold a meeting on Tuesday, the August 6th, but he's giving you 2 extra days because he needs to go attend to some family business in Pittsburgh that requires his immediate attention, and he can't go any further than August 8th. Okay. Now, that's deeply unsettling to a number of people. William Clayton, who was there in the meeting, he wrote, quote, I do not feel satisfied with this move because it is universally understood that the 12 have been sent for and are expected here every day. And it seems a plot has been laid for the saints to take advantage of their situation. So he thinks it's kind of devious what's happening here. It seems like Sidney's trying to hurry things along before all the 12 apostles have returned to Nauvoo. And that's the end of day 2.
Yeah, so Sidney kind of makes the first move here. He refuses to meet with the apostles that are there, and he tries to arrange this meeting, it seems like, in the hope that he can just be sustained as the leader of the church before the apostles show up.
Yeah.
And it also seems like he's working in collaboration with William Marks, and he's thinking, I'll get this done.
Yeah.
So he's supposed to meet with the apostles. He instead goes to this meeting and announces he's supposed to lead the church. And then when the apostles try to counter that, like the apostles that are in Nauvoo, he basically says, no, I don't have time for this.
Yeah.
We're going to move ahead. Like I've got things I've got to do. So it seems like he's trying to sort of sweep in, take over before they can fully gather the quorums of the church. So he's the one that kind of causes the succession crisis, I guess you'd say. If he hadn't made this move, it's possible there would have been calm discussion over what was supposed to happen, but he immediately sort of like blows everything up by saying, no, I'm the person that's supposed to lead the church.
Yeah, it does seem like he is trying to take advantage of the chaos of the moment before level heads can figure things out here.
Yeah.
And by the way, William Clayton says that he learned later from Alpheus Cutler that Sidney Rigdon had planned to be president, and he planned to appoint William Marks as church patriarch.
Yeah.
And so you see this interesting alliance between Sidney and William Marks going on here. Interesting.
Just for reference, too, patriarch was the position that Hyrum Smith held. And so it was kind of like Rigdon was saying, I'll take over and you're going to be the Hyrum to my Joseph, basically. That's why the two of them are in close collaboration here together.
Yeah.
All right, so day 3.
Day 3.
Day 3 is Monday, August 5th. The apostles are kind of floored that Sidney makes this move, and so they continue trying to have a meeting with him. They actually go to him and they meet with him, Parley P. Pratt, Willard Richards, George A. Smith. There's even one source that says that John Taylor went to meet with him, which is extraordinary if that's true, because he's still in bad shape. They also bring along Newell K. Whitney, who's the presiding bishop, and Amasa Lyman, who had been chosen to serve as a counselor in the first presidency. So they're trying to line up all the church authorities that are in town to basically say, hey, before we do anything, we've got to sit together and talk about this. And everybody agrees to meet at John Taylor's home in the evening. So this is Monday evening. And according to people that are in the meeting, Sidney Rigdon shows up at this meeting and he sort of like talks very boldly and he's pacing back and forth in front of the apostles. He starts to like spout off all these concerns, like we've got to do this soon because there's going to be anti-Mormons elected in Hancock County. That's going to cause more problems for us. And then according to someone that's in the meeting, he makes this statement. He told them, you lack a great leader and said, you want a head? And unless you unite upon that head, you're blown to the four winds. The anti-Mormons will carry the election. A guardian must be appointed. This is a word that comes up a lot in Rigdon's succession claims, is that he wanted to be the guardian of the church.
Yeah.
So this really doesn't convince the apostles, and they continue to try and say, all right, fine, but let's put off any meetings where decisions can be made until the rest of the apostles can make it back from their missions. But the only thing Sidney Rigdon will promise to do is he's going to change the meeting that he announced for Thursday into a prayer meeting for discussion and interchange of thought and feeling to warm up each other's hearts. And he promises them that it's not going to be a business meeting to make binding decisions. So they do get him to back off a little bit on that score, but they're still really worried that he's trying to take over before anybody can get back. And Rigdon's arguing in return, no, we got to do something right now or we're going to lose everything because opposition's rising. So that's day 3 of the succession crisis.
Day 3. Okay. And it seems interesting that Sidney is tying local politics in with the necessity of having him as the guardian of the church. He says, if I'm not the guardian and you're not united around me, we're going to be blown to the 4 winds by the anti-Mormons who carry the election. I don't see the connection between him being the leader of the church and being able to forestall or combat the anti-Mormons who are going to carry the election, quote unquote. It just seems these points are not connected, but he thought they were somehow. And
yeah, he's kind of trying to make that argument of, well, we need strong leadership. Like there's stuff that's going to happen. And if we can't coalesce around one person, then we're going to get wiped out in the elections. And then who knows what will happen next if the anti-Mormons sweep into power. That's kind of his argument, basically.
Yeah, super interesting. All right, day 4, Tuesday, August 6th, 1844. On Tuesday, Sidney once again preaches a sermon. We don't know the audience on this occasion, but Sidney spoke about mobs coming to attack Nauvoo. He recalls the persecution of the saints in Missouri. And again, it seems like he is leaning into the fears of people about what might happen, right? He insists to this group, apparently, that he wanted no office in the kingdom of God, even if it were offered to him. Instead, he says he would be a constable upon the earth rather than a priestly king. He's just kind of going back and forth on these things. I want to be the guardian of the church. I want to be the head. Everyone should coalesce around me. I had a vision that I'm to be the guy. And then in this meeting, he's saying, I don't even want an office in the kingdom of God, even if it's offered. I'll be a constable. So interesting. That evening, this is a big moment, the evening of Tuesday, August 6th, Brigham Young and 4 other apostles arrive. Heber C. Kimball, Orson Pratt, Lyman White, and Wilford Woodruff. They arrive in Nauvoo on the steamboat St. Croix. They had made this marathon trip from Boston to Buffalo, New York, across Lake Erie to Detroit, and then down to Chicago. They had made the 160-mile trip across Illinois to Nauvoo in just 48 hours, which before the days of automobiles and airplanes, that's something significant right there. 48-hour trip, 160 miles. Elder Woodruff recalled, quote, "We were hailed with joy by all the citizens we met," close quote, when they stepped off from the wharf into Nauvoo. Yet despite this happy occasion of meeting friends and family again, Woodruff also felt something else, he said. Quote, "When we landed in the city, there was a deep gloom that seemed to rest over the city of Nauvoo, which we never experienced before." So he notices that Nauvoo is not just a place of grief and sorrow, but it also seems to be a place of fear about the future, of where things are going.
Yeah.
So the major thing that happens on day 4 is that these 4 members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles arrive, and especially Brigham Young, the president of the Quorum of the 12.
Yeah.
And what this means, Casey, which is a big deal, is that now we have a majority of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in Nauvoo, right? We have a quorum.
Yeah.
We have a quorum.
Yeah, so the apostles get into town on day 4. That leads into day 5 of the succession crisis, which is Wednesday, August 7th, 1844. And most of this day, the apostles are kind of huddled together. They meet at John Taylor's house. Like you mentioned, this is the first time in several months that they've had a full quorum.
Yeah.
Or at least a majority. That means 7 of the apostles to discuss what's going on. This is the first time they've really had a group meeting since Joseph and Hyrum were killed, where they could talk in person and sort of share their feelings. And it seems like, even though we don't have a lot of good records about what they discussed, it's likely that they're talking about what kind of church it's going to be. This is the way Ron Walker phrases it. He says, the succession of 1844 was not simply about appointing a man or a group of men to lead the church. It was about what kind of church would survive. And the two issues are kind of hand in hand. Like we mentioned, there was a lot of fear, especially among people in the Quorum of the Anointed. We've talked about the Quorum of the Anointed several episodes. This was the group of people that had received the temple ordinances that had been endowed,
Yeah,
had been sealed to their spouses. Many of them had entered into eternal marriages and plural marriages. And there was a lot of fear that Sidney Rigdon and William Marks wanted to take the church back. For instance, William Clayton, who's one of Joseph's personal secretaries, and he's very closely aligned with the 12, said if William Marks is appointed trustee, because they were talking about a leader for the church and a trustee and trust that would handle the financial matters of the church.
Yeah.
William Clayton wrote, if Marks is appointed trustee, our spiritual blessings will be destroyed inasmuch as he is not favorable to the most important matters. And Clayton doesn't spell out exactly what that means, but it's very, very likely that what he means is the temple ordinances.
Yeah.
This new system of sealing, this new system of family connection is going to go away. In fact, Ron Walker kind of speculated that all the stuff that was put in Nauvoo, the temple ceremonies, and other things too, work for the dead, the Relief Society, the Council of 50, prayer circles, a lot of these things that we take for granted in the church today would probably go away. And you can actually see that in what happens with the reorganized church, because William Marks plays a huge role in organizing the reorganized church. And they're basically, I mean, I know people from the RLDS tradition that will basically say, yeah, we're the church without Nauvoo. Like,
Yeah.
they didn't like the stuff in Nauvoo. And you can see that in the RLDS tradition, there's still a temple, but they don't do work for the dead in it. They don't believe in or practice eternal marriage. They've rejected most of the stuff that was received in Nauvoo. That seems to be what William Marks's vision was, and it seems like Sidney Rigdon was more than willing to go along with that.
I think that's borne out in terms of Sidney Rigdon, because we know what his church looked like. Later on, Sidney does actually start a church, maybe two churches, you could argue.
Yeah.
One he calls the Church of Christ, and then he reorganizes it decades later after its collapse in 1847. It's called the Church of Jesus Christ of the Children of Zion from like 1863 to 1884. And in both of those versions of his church, neither of them had the Nauvoo doctrines or practices. So I think Ron Walker's hypothesis here is borne out in what Sidney actually does when he does organize a church. So,
yeah. And I mean, the perspective of the apostles, on the other hand, is that this is Joseph's inner circle while he's in Nauvoo. And they have already committed to these teachings. They have a testimony of these teachings. They know that Joseph and Hyrum endorsed these teachings. And it seems like, you know, they've already paid kind of the emotional and psychological cost of adjusting to that, especially something really challenging like plural marriage, and they're not going to go back. So
yeah.
The apostles in their meeting decide that they're going to hold a general assembly within the week. In fact, they aim for Tuesday, August 13th at 10 a.m. And there they're going to put forward their claims and ask for a formal ratifying vote. They also make two other decisions. They wanted a semi-public airing of Rigdon's claims. They wanted to hear what Sidney Rigdon had to say. And they scheduled a meeting with Sidney Rigdon in the 70s hall later on that day. And so they give Sidney an opportunity to kind of speak his piece, explain what he thinks is the right thing to do. And then at 4 p.m. that day, they meet with Sidney Rigdon. Now, we don't have complete minutes of the meeting, but several people that were in the meeting with Sidney Rigdon left behind their own accounts, most prominently Wilford Woodruff. And Wilford Woodruff's papers are available. You can go and actually look this up in his journal if you want to. But they meet with Sidney. They ask about the vision that he shared with everybody. Sidney, according to Wilford Woodruff, says it was not an open vision, but it was a stirring that had come into his mind and was a kind of continuation of the vision that he and Joseph had in 1832. This is Doctrine and Covenants 76, the vision of the 3 degrees of glory. So Sidney's saying it was a continuation of that vision. William Clayton, who's also in the meeting, he wrote, quote, "It was shown to him," meaning Sidney Rigdon, "that this church must be built up to Joseph, and that all the blessings we receive must come through Joseph. He had been ordained spokesman to Joseph, and he must come to Nauvoo and see that the church was governed in a proper manner." And so Sidney's tying it to Joseph. It seems like he's making a kind of case that Joseph will lead the church from beyond the veil, but that he's going to act as a spokesman like he's always done before. And the apostles aren't really blown away. Wilford Woodruff said that it was a long story, and he calls Sidney's vision a second-class vision.
Yeah.
That's the wording in his journal.
Such a great line. It was a second-class vision.
Yeah, it was a second-class vision.
Only apostles can like assess one another's visions in this way. That was kind of a second-class vision.
Yeah, and it does seem like once they press Sidney on it, he's kind of like, I don't know if it was an open vision.
More like a stirring. It was more like a stirring that had come to my mind. Yeah,
it was like a feeling, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So William Clayton also says that once Sidney Rigdon had shared his vision, Brigham Young stands up and sort of just bluntly puts everything on the line. William Clayton said, Brigham said he did not care who led the church if God said so, even if it was old Ann Lee. That's referring to the leader of the Shakers.
Yeah.
But he said he must know that God said so. He said he had the keys and the means of knowing the mind of God on the subject. And so you've got Rigdon on one side saying, I'm supposed to lead because I was Joseph's spokesman. You've got Brigham saying, well, I have the keys and I think I can discern who's going to lead. And it's clear that there's a conflict set up here.
Yeah.
Brigham Young doesn't accept Sidney Rigdon's claims, and Sidney Rigdon is trying to press ahead. And we don't know from the notes of the meeting if they all agreed, like, oh, in 1 week, let's vote on this. Let's present our case to the church. But it seems like that was the plan that the apostles were set to, is, okay, let's take a week to discuss this, and then we'll have an open vote among the members of the church in 1 week. They're aiming for August 13th. But instead, everything happens the next day, August 8th, 1844, day 6.
Yeah. Okay, before we go on to day 6, can we just take out a metaphorical highlighter and just highlight really boldly how important it is, what you were talking about earlier, Casey, that concern here, as Ron Walker, I guess he's the one that brought it up, is not just who will lead the church, but what kind of church will survive. Like, the stakes here could not be higher. Anyone but the 12 apostles is going to abandon the temple, Casey. They're going to abandon eternal marriage. They're going to abandon all of those ordinances. Like, for instance, William Marks, it is said of him that he, quote, cared little for the ordinances of the temple, close quote. When the RLDS church comes about, Joseph Smith III does nothing with the temple. It's true, Community of Christ does have a temple in Independence, Missouri, but they do not use that temple for ordinances. That is basically church headquarters, right, with offices for leadership and an auditorium to have meetings, but there is nothing of the Nauvoo temple ordinances that is done in that temple. James Strang said that the temple was a, quote, monument to materialism, close quote. Sidney Rigdon, like was mentioned, he never pursues anything temple related at all. Really, like, the stakes here are temple or no temple. Like, if you go with the 12, then you're going with the Nauvoo practices and doctrines. If you do not go with the 12, you will not be left with anything that looks like the Nauvoo church. It's going to be a Kirtland church or a New York church. And so, again, it's odd that each of these other claims to succession would neglect the temple like that because of how obviously vitally important the temple was to Joseph Smith, right? For anyone to claim to be his successor and then to ignore or belittle the importance of the temple, I think, is to immediately call into question their legitimacy. I mean, that's just, the Nauvoo temple's right there. It's rising. It's obviously a Joseph Smith project.
And I agree with you. And I find myself always taking the contrary position, but just to speak on their behalf.
Yes, please.
It feels like the thing that caused them to reject the temple was that they associated it with plural marriage.
Totally.
That they don't like plural marriage, and they see eternal marriage and sealing and all that. Now, there's an argument that it's more than that too, because none of them practice baptism for the dead either.
Right.
Except for the Cutlerites, though the RLDS church at least recognizes that as a legitimate practice. They'll just basically say, we just decided not to do it, essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea of sealing of ordinances that go beyond this life is tied up in the temple. But for them, it's also tied to plural marriage, which they find very difficult, very controversial.
Yeah, 100%. And you and I have been in meeting with our kind of cousins of the Restoration, right? And I remember one of them saying to us that they felt like Joseph had become a fallen prophet after Missouri. And this fallen prophet idea comes up a lot, that he was legitimate in New York. He was legitimate in Kirtland, Missouri time period. But after that, the fact that he doesn't establish Zion as the Lord had commanded him to, etc., were evidences that he was a fallen prophet. Now, of course, the quorum of the 12 apostles cannot get behind the idea of Joseph conducting a fallen ministry the last few years of his life. Like that's out of the question completely for them. So like you mentioned, they are all in. There's no turning back for the quorum of the 12. Like, it's temple and polygamy or bust. Like, it's all of it, right? It's all of it or none of it. And they are all in here. So I just wanted to metaphorically highlight that, because I think that is a super huge piece to this puzzle in terms of understanding like what's at stake here. It's kind of a big deal in terms of the destiny and direction of this church. So there you go. That's the end of day 5.
Well said.
Okay, day 6.
Day 6.
So by Thursday, August 8th, this so-called succession crisis comes to a head here. The apostles had scheduled a private meeting for 9 a.m. They believed Sidney's meeting would take place about an hour later, though there may have been some confusion over the time of Sidney's meeting. There's also confusion over what the purpose of Sidney's meeting was anymore, right? Because he said it was going to be a prayer meeting, but then turns out maybe not. Also, Brigham Young doesn't show to that morning meeting. Ron Walker thinks it might be because of his exhaustion and stress the past month finally catching up to him. We're not sure. But by mid-morning, Brigham does come out and he sees people streaming into a grove where the saints held their public meetings, and he realized that this was Sidney's meeting. And there at that meeting, Sidney spoke for an hour and a half. This is the meeting where, until recently, we didn't have actually a good recording of what he said. But as you mentioned, Robin Jensen and Legene Carruth has translated the shorthand notes taken by Thomas Bullock in that meeting. Do you want to review quickly, Casey, what we now know from those notes of Thomas Bullock about what Sidney said there?
Yeah, and the notes are still choppy. Like translating shorthand isn't an exact science. And Legene Carruth is about the only person I know that can do it.
Yeah.
But according to the notes of the meeting, Sidney kind of stressed this idea again that Joseph is still the leader of the church. For instance, he said the mob had no power to take away his authority. He said the Smiths maintained their authority and they ever on have the priesthood and will hold it in all eternity, which I don't know if we disagree with him there.
Yeah.
But it seems like he's using it to kind of push the idea that the first presidency still exists, therefore his authority still exists. He spoke of the potential of the church to be, quote, one grand kingdom to put an end to strifes and bloodshed and war. And though the church had been robbed of their leader, he conferred every power that was necessary to carry the kingdom on and place it precisely on the tenets that Jehovah had given him. Rigdon sort of saw Joseph's influence coming from beyond the grave and said, I view Joseph as sitting in heaven with power to make himself known to anyone. And then he starts talking about how the authority is in the church. And he even sort of kind of makes an outreach to the quorum of the 12. He says, I have the fullest belief that every man will stand in his own place and stand in his own calling. So again, he's emphasizing there's been no big changes. Joseph is still leading the church. That means by kind of default, he's leader because he's first counselor. And he said that the mobs don't have power to destroy Nauvoo. He said that peace would come for a season. And then this is kind of a summary. He said, I should be a spokesman for our prophet who has been taken from us.
There's the rub right there, right?
Yeah.
I will be the spokesman.
Yeah, he's using this again to push to the people his position, okay? And in the middle of this, Brigham Young shows up. This is kind of the big dramatic moment, all right? Brigham Young realizes what's happening, and he gets up on the stand, and he inserts himself and says, I will manage the voting. So
shoot.
It seemed like, according to Brigham Young, Sidney was kind of leading up to a vote without the 12 there. And Brigham Young sort of strides onto the stand and says, I will manage this voting for Elder Rigdon. He does not preside here. And then he says, this child, referring to himself, meaning Brigham Young, will manage this flock for a season. And then Brigham Young says, we're going too fast. He complained of a hurrying spirit. He said, the true organization of the church requires formal voting by the people in a special seating arrangement. And seeing that Sidney is the one who's pressing and pressing, Brigham basically says, okay, we'll meet at 2 p.m. today. Same place, everybody come back, and we'll decide who the leader of the church is going to be. So Brigham basically calls Sidney's bluff. He shows up and says, all right, before you call for a vote, we have to have all the church assembled. We have to have formal authorities. I'll lead the voting, but let's get everybody here, because he sort of seems to be implying that Sidney was sort of surreptitiously organizing this meeting to just pass the vote and then take it to the apostles and tell them what had happened. So Brigham Young suggests,
let's meet in the afternoon.
Let's meet in the afternoon. And at 2 p.m. they meet, sort of. It gets complicated.
So in that meeting, afternoon meeting is apparently it starts like 45 minutes late.
They have to get everybody together. So they send out like the general alarm. Everybody, we're meeting at 2 p.m. We're going to figure this out. It just happens all of a sudden.
Kind of this ad hoc extemporaneous meeting get everyone there you can. So they start more like 2:45. Sidney's on the stand, Brigham's on the stand, at least 7 members of the 12 are on the stand, along with William Marks, the stake president, and the Nauvoo High Council. This gathering has all the high priests of the church, 70s elders, and Aaronic priesthood that were in Nauvoo at the time. Some estimates say that the crowd consisted of about 6,000 church members or more. We don't have a complete account of what Brigham Young said at that meeting, although Wilford Woodruff and others took notes. Here's a few things we can piece together from those notes. So one of the things Brigham says is he doesn't want to take care of this business so close to the murders, if he could help it, but it seems like it is essential to do so. There was no shorthand reporter here to capture everything that was said, but we do get sporadic phrases and sentences. I want to share a few of those with you as far as what we have of Brigham Young's speech. He said, and I'm pulling this from the History of the Church, Volume 7, he said, among other things, this: "Here is President Rigdon, who was counselor to Joseph. I ask, where are Joseph and Hyrum? They are gone beyond the veil. And if Elder Rigdon wants to act as his counselor, he must go beyond the veil where he is." Shoot. He says, "The 12 are appointed by the finger of God. Here is Brigham," speaking of himself. "Have his knees ever faltered? Have his lips ever quivered? Here is Heber and the rest of the 12, an independent body, who have the keys of the priesthood, the keys of the kingdom of God, to deliver to all the world. This is true, so help me God. They," meaning the 12, "stand next to Joseph and are as the first presidency of the church." He's invoking that D&C 107 passage we talked about, verse 23, 24.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, "Elder Rigdon claims to be spokesman to the prophet." Right? And that's what he had said earlier that morning. "Very well, he was," says Brigham. "But can he now act in that office? If he wants now to be a spokesman to the prophet, he must go to the other side of the veil, for the prophet is there, but Elder Rigdon is here. Why will Elder Rigdon be a fool?" He asks. He says, "Now, if you want Sidney Rigdon to lead you or anybody else, you are welcome to them. But I tell you in the name of the Lord that no man can put another between the 12 and the prophet Joseph. Why? Because Joseph was their file leader, and he has committed into their hands the keys of the kingdom in this last dispensation for all the world." This is Brigham Young's major point of contention, right? That the 12 have the keys. Think back to the last charge meeting. We talked about that last episode, how significant the last charge meeting was. And it seems to slowly dawn on the 12 how significant that was.
Mm-hmm.
And now Brigham Young gets it, and he's explaining this very clearly to this crowd from the piecemeal notes that we have. That seems to be his major contention here.
Yeah. At the end of the meeting, some surprising thing happened. Like, Sidney Rigdon actually gets up and kind of makes a feeble defense, but he asks W.W. Phelps if he'll speak on his behalf. And W.W. Phelps goes up and he actually endorses the 12. So the guy that's supposed to defend Sidney is like, "No, actually, I think the 12 should lead the church."
Yeah.
And then right after that, Parley P. Pratt, who's incredibly popular among the saints, speaks as well on behalf of the 12.
Yeah.
A vote is called for, and the people overwhelmingly choose Brigham Young. Like, that's one thing that nobody disputes about this meeting, is that when the vote was taken, Brigham Young was chosen as the leader of the church. So this is kind of unique because most of our voting in church meetings is sustaining. We're supporting a decision that's been made in councils.
Yeah.
This was an actual vote of who was supposed to lead the church. And I don't think anybody disputes that Brigham Young was the person chosen in that meeting. No. Brigham Young and the 12 specifically.
But what is disputed is whether or not Brigham Young was transfigured before the crowd, right?
Yeah.
This is the point of contention here. And most members of the church have probably heard something about this.
Yeah.
That Brigham Young kind of took on the look or at least the sound of Joseph Smith almost to a T. Some people said they couldn't tell the difference, etc. But that's recently been contested. Why has that been contested, Casey?
Partially it's because of, nerdy historian stuff. But Richard Van Wagener, we mentioned him in the first of the episode, wrote a biography of Sidney Rigdon. But even before that, he wrote an article. And among other things, he said this, quote, "When the 8th of August, 1844 is stripped of emotional overlay, there is not a shred of irrefutable contemporary evidence to support the occurrence of a mystical event, either in the morning or the afternoon gatherings of that day.
Ooh.
A more likely scenario was that it was the force of Young's commanding presence, his well-timed arrival at the morning meeting, and perhaps a bit of theatrical mimicry." So, I mean, on the one hand, he's just saying that Brigham Young's timing was better. that he was a more forceful leader than Sidney Rigdon, but he's also making a little charge here that Brigham deliberately
impersonated Joseph Smith.
Yeah. And by the way, Van Wagoner is correct that one of the difficult things with this as a historian is that nobody does record a miracle that day. Wilford Woodruff, for instance, records the entire meeting, but he doesn't say anything about transfiguration.
Yeah.
Neither does anybody else who's at the meeting on that day.
Isn't that kind of suspicious?
It's a little suspicious. There could be reasons for that. But at the same time, too, I think that Van Wagoner goes too far in saying, well, that means there's no evidence. And he also really sets the bar here high by saying there's no irrefutable contemporary evidence.
Yeah.
Because there is some stuff that's fairly contemporary.
Yeah. There is evidence that needs to be considered here.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is if there's not any contemporary accounts, we have to weigh the fact that there are a ton of non-contemporary accounts. Like I said, BYU Studies and Lynn Jorgensen tracked down 129 different accounts of people saying they saw something. But here's the thing. The accounts aren't uniform. They don't all say the same thing. And so it seems like it was a collection of individual spiritual experiences and not something that the whole crowd witnessed. Like some people talk about it in very simple terms. Some people talk about it in really grand spiritual terms. One person who didn't account of any kind of special miracle happening was Brigham Young himself. Brigham Young wrote his own account of what happened in the meeting. Here's what he wrote. He said, I arose and spoke to the people. My heart was swollen with compassion towards them. And by the power of the Holy Ghost, even the spirit of the prophets, I was enabled to comfort the hearts of the saints. In the afternoon, according to my request, the people assembled by the thousands. I laid before them the order of the church and the power of the priesthood. After a long and laborious talk of about 2 hours in the open air with the wind blowing, the church was of one heart and one mind. They wanted the 12 to lead the church as Brother Joseph had done in his day. So Brigham Young doesn't record anything happening. But again, Van Wagoner's pushing the point too hard to say nobody recorded anything or that we have to have irrefutable evidence that this happened. It seems like what the accounts kind of go for is that there were individual spiritual experiences and people wrote them down, but not on that day. But they did write them down, and a lot of people wrote them down
later.
At least so many people that we can't easily dismiss this as something that just was an emotional response, which is what Van Wagoner's kind of trying to make it sound like.
Yeah. Okay, so Brigham Young, from his own account, doesn't seem to say anything specific about any miracle, although he says that he spoke by the spirit of the prophets. I mean, that's the closest thing, right, in his account that says anything that might be kind of even close to what others will later say. But where do the accounts start, Casey, that Brigham actually looked like Joseph or sounded like Joseph or both? Like, how long in the historical record do we have to go before we find our first account of that? If there's no contemporary accounts, what's the next best thing?
So when we say contemporary, there aren't any from that day that mention a transfiguration.
Okay.
But as early as September, so this happens in August.
Yeah.
As early as September, people start mentioning this happening. And it's sometimes in less grand terms than we're used to. For instance, in September, the Times and Seasons talks about the mantle of Joseph falling on Brigham Young. And that's usually how the early accounts sort of describe it.
Yeah.
It's just clear that the mantle, that like, using that phraseology that comes from the Old Testament, where Elijah's mantle fell on Elijah, it's describing that.
Yeah.
But I mean, even someone like D. Michael Quinn quickly goes through the sources and describes a kind of a transfiguration. For instance, Times and Seasons reports that every saint could see that Elijah's mantle had fallen upon the 12. The church newspaper doesn't specifically refer to Brigham Young, but on the 15th of November, 1844, so this is just 2 or 3 months after, Henry and Catherine Brooke, who are people that live in Nauvoo, wrote a letter saying that Brigham Young, quote, favors Brother Joseph both in person, manner of speaking, more than any person you ever saw looks like another. And then 5 days later, Ezra Hinckley referred to Brigham Young, on whom the mantle of the prophet Joseph has fallen. So there were some within a couple months, but as time goes on, people are asked to kind of come in, share their experiences with the church historian, and we start to get this rich historiography that's collected in Opening the Heavens. Like I said, 129 accounts, and they range from fairly mundane to, you know what, I knew that they were the people that were supposed to lead the church, to fairly extraordinary. For instance, this is Judge William Hyde. William Hyde is a citizen of Nauvoo. This is the way he describes it. He said, in the afternoon, President Brigham Young came to the stand and addressed the vast multitude of anxious listeners as follows. The church had the privilege of coming to Joseph and of receiving, but he's now stepped to the other side of the veil. He loved the church even unto death and laid down his life for it. President Young again arose and spoke concerning the endowments of the elders. On this day, it was plainly manifest that the mantle of Joseph had rested upon President Young. The voice of the same Spirit by which he, Joseph, spake was this day sounded in our ears, so much so that I once, unthoughtedly, raised my head to see if it was not actually Joseph addressing the assembly. So that's not too out there, right? He's saying, I thought I heard Joseph's voice, but he could be speaking kind of metaphorically. There's other people that talk about it in more dramatic terms, like William Adams. Like, do you want to read William Adams for me here?
Yes. William said, quote, "There was a great multitude attending the meeting. More than one half the crowd could not find seats and stood on their feet. Never were so many at one meeting that I ever saw. I was sitting down and could not see the speakers on the stand. I was listening very attentively so that I could hear every word. I heard a voice speaking. I was surprised and jumped to my feet, expecting Joseph the prophet was speaking, having heard him often in public and private, so that I was quite acquainted with his voice. This was a strong testimony that the 12 apostles were the rightful leaders of the church and that the mouth of Joseph had fallen on Brigham Young."
Okay, so his is a little bit more boom, like I jumped up on my feet because I thought that Joseph had come back.
Yeah.
Now, this next account, we're going to have a special guest read.
Special guest reader.
Special cameo. And can I say who the cameo is, or do you want to say who it is?
Okay, this is one of my favorite people in the whole world. We wanted a reader for Caroline Barnes Crosby, and since she's a woman, we wanted to give an authentic voice. So we invited my wife, Sarah Woodward, to read this. So let's hear Sarah read it now.
Caroline Barnes Crosby, age 37. Sidney Rigdon came to the stand and tried to show the people that he was the rightful successor of Joseph, and his arguments were so powerful that many were almost persuaded to believe him such. But as soon as the 12 apostles, with Brother Brigham Young at their head, took the stand, it was shown conclusively where the power rested. It was the first time that I ever thought he, Brigham, resembled Brother Joseph. But almost everyone exclaimed that the mantle of Joseph had fallen on Brigham. For one, I never had any doubts afterward. We all soon became comforted concerning our leaders, but persecution continued all around us. The brethren were obliged to be on guard all the time.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that.
But let's analyze here. She's not saying anything too extraordinary either. She said, it was the first time I ever thought that Brigham resembled Brother Joseph, but almost everyone exclaimed that the mantle of Joseph had fallen on Brigham. So again, the accounts aren't uniform. Here's another one. This is Homer Duncan. He was 29 years old. He said, I must make mention on one more manifestation of the Lord's goodness to me. At the special meeting held at Nauvoo after the prophet Joseph Smith's death, at that time the mantle of the prophet of the Lord fell upon Brigham Young. I sat listening to someone speaking with my head down, my face in the palms of my hands, and my elbows on my knees. While in this position, Brigham Young came to the stand and commenced to speak with the voice of Joseph the prophet. Being so well acquainted with the prophet's voice, I nearly sprang from my seat through astonishment. But I sat and heard the prophet's voice as long as Brigham Young was speaking. Not only did the voice of Brigham sound like that of Joseph, but the very gestures of his right hand when he was saying anything very positive reminded me of Joseph. My decision was then made as to who should lead the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for surely the mantle of Joseph had fallen upon Brigham. So, again, he's saying it surprised him that the gestures and things were the same.
Yeah.
But he's also going back to and saying the spiritual witness was the important thing that was impressed on my mind. He's the person that's supposed to lead the church.
My decision was then made as to who should lead the church. Yeah. You mentioned that these aren't all saying the exact same thing, but neither are they contradicting each other, right? I mean, this is what you'd expect if this was an authentic type of an experience.
Yeah.
Although I do wonder why they all keep saying the mantle of Joseph has fallen on Brigham. That almost seems like an institutional phrase by that time. Like, I wonder if someone started that phrase and it started to pick up steam and everyone started to kind of talk about this experience using that phraseology. because I'm not sure that your average person would, just use that phrase.
That makes sense, because that's kind of how the phrase starts to show up in the earliest accounts, as the mantle had fallen upon Brigham Young, which is a biblical phrase. It's very common.
Yeah.
We still use that phrase in the church today when a new prophet's called, or when a person is placed into a position of authority, the mantle came upon them.
Yeah. Okay, our next one we want to do is Emily Smith Hoyt. And for that, we have another cameo. Do you want to introduce our next cameo, Casey?
Yes, the next cameo is my wife, Elizabeth Otley Griffiths. And I am excited to hear her bring Emily Hoyt to life, because this is one of my favorite accounts. So here we go.
Emily Smith Hoyt, age 37. After the martyrdom, we, Emily and Samuel, were summoned over the river again and went to hear what was wanted. Brigham Young and the president of the 12 had returned home. The people were convened in the old Bowery where Joseph had last spoken to the people. Sidney Rigdon made a speech and claimed to have authority to lead the church. Others had similar claims. None appeared reasonable to me. The last one arose. It was the then president of the 12, Brigham Young. He spoke to the people all together in a different style from any of those who preceded him. A crowd of witnesses arose after Brigham Young had sat down and testified to the truth of what he had said. President Brigham Young arose from his seat the second time and addressed the audience. I had been well acquainted with Joseph the latter part of his life. We had been at his home many times, and Joseph, Hyrum, and the families felt at home with us. The God of heaven, who had said it was his business to provide for his saints, sent President Brigham Young home just in time, and clothed him not with the mantle of Elijah, but the spirit and power which had rested on Joseph. I was an eye and ear witness. The manner of reasoning, the expression of countenance, the sound of the voice thrilled my whole soul. My own eyes had beheld Joseph's murdered body. My own hands had felt death's icy coldness on his once noble forehead. I knew that Joseph was dead, and yet I often startled and involuntarily looked at the stand to see if it was not Joseph. It was not. It was Brigham Young, and if anyone doubts the right of Brigham to manage affairs for the saints, all I have to say to them is this: get the Spirit of God and know for yourselves. The Lord will provide for his own.
Thank you, Liz. This one you can see Emily is very well educated. She's very thoughtful, and she's very specific. She is not speaking in any kind of hyperbole. She's very exact in saying, here's what I saw, here's what happened, and here's what I witnessed. It's nothing too extraordinary, but she says, you know what? I knew Joseph Smith. I knew him well. She's making a definite claim here.
Yeah.
Let's do another one. You do this one.
Okay, this one is William A. Watkins. He said, quote, a meeting was appointed for August 8, 1844, by which time Brigham Young and most of the other apostles had returned home. It was at this meeting Sidney Rigdon made a lengthy and tedious speech presenting his claims, telling the people what wonderful things he had planned for them. The darkness was soon dispelled, for Brigham Young explained before the people on that day the order of the priesthood. He was filled with the power of the Holy Ghost. He stood before the people as the prophet Joseph Smith often had done, and we heard the voice of the true shepherd, for he spoke with the voice of Joseph. His manner and appearance were like unto Joseph's, and it was manifested to all those present upon whom the responsibility rested to carry on the work of God and lead the saints.
So here's another example of an early one. This is from George Morris, and I really love this one because he even puts in sound effects when he's doing this.
My kind of guy.
He writes, in the afternoon, President Young arose. When I was startled by hearing Joseph's voice, he had a way of clearing his throat before he began to speak by a peculiar effort of his own, like, I raised my head suddenly, and the first thing I saw was Joseph. As plain as I ever saw him in my life, that was testimony enough to convince me where the proper authority rested. And so this guy is saying something extraordinary, that he just looked up and saw Joseph Smith. He actually saw Joseph, and Brigham cleared his throat the way Joseph did. That kind of thing. So again, the accounts aren't uniform across the board, but they do kind of...
They coalesce. Yeah.
They coalesce. Yeah. They pretty much say all the same thing. And it's possible that some of these which were recorded later may have been going off of what they had heard other people say. But there's 120 29 in this one account, in this one document alone.
Yeah.
And that's so many that we can't dismiss that something extraordinary happened. I mean, credit to Lynn Jorgensen and the team at BYU Studies for putting these all together. And again, you can download them and read them for yourself for free.
Yeah.
But there's so many of them that I think Van Wagener really sort of is too dismissive when he says, oh, it's just an emotional thing that kind of spiraled. There's a lot of people that say something happened in the meeting, and they're really specific about what they say.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to dismiss them.
And there's even like some children, which is cool. They don't record their account until they're a little older, but they say, I was a kid and I looked up and I said, Mommy, Brother Joseph's back. There's a few of those kind of accounts as well, which are pretty cool.
Yeah.
I recommend just reading all of them. The historical caution here is, nobody wrote it down the day that it happened. The first recording happens a month later. We get a month later. We have somebody mentioning it.
Yeah. Times and Seasons mentions it.
Yep. Times and Seasons. And then from there, we get a trickle. And then I feel like there was a time in Utah where anyone who had witnessed it was asked to come forth and write down their experience, right? Kind of all at once. Am I remembering that right from the article?
I believe so, yeah. And it may have been around the time that the RLDS Church started to assert its claims.
Yeah.
That they invited anybody who was there to come in and record it.
Yeah.
The other kind of surge is in the early 20th century, where a lot of these people are kind of getting up in years and they're going to pass away and they want to record their experiences, which actually, this is fairly normal when it comes to history, is that a lot of people don't take the time to record their experiences unless someone asks them to, or they're getting near the end of their life and they're realizing, if I don't write this down, it's going to be lost. And so it does kind of fit that pattern as well. But again, I want to emphasize there's nothing from that day specifically, but it's also not a uniform spiritual experience. A lot of people see and experience different things.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is there's just so many of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's difficult to dismiss them.
Yeah.
By the way, let me mention too, while there might be disputes over whether or not Brigham Young was transfigured, nobody disputes that Brigham Young and the 12 were chosen as the leaders of the church.
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah. Ron Walker says, you know what, when everything was presented to the saints, the choice was clear. They choose Brigham Young. Sidney Rigdon initially goes along with this too. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next episode. But this event basically solidifies support around the 12, and the 12 become the dominant leaders from there on out. Even though there's still going to be schisms, even though there's going to be people that split off, the 12 are seen as the central figures that the church kind of coalesces around during this time.
Yeah. Well, that was really fun to review together, Casey. Very important history here. And to conclude, could I just top us off with a quote from Elder Jeffrey R. Holland?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Here's what he says about this event. Quote, by momentarily giving Brigham Young Joseph's appearance and very manner of speech, quite literally his mantle, God said to the people, there in Nauvoo, the keys of the kingdom are with the 12. Brigham is Joseph's rightful successor in leading the church. That is the obvious and very important declaration about church governance the Lord was making. Then he says, but an even more important declaration was the manifestation of heavenly power itself. God's might and direct involvement in this issue was the truly important thing that was conveyed here. Not that Brigham Young was to be in charge, or even that Joseph Smith had been in charge. The message was, God is in charge. That was the message of August 8th, 1844.
That's it. And we're going to talk about how prophetic succession kind of evolved over time, but I think we needed this big, dramatic, spiritual event to kind of kick things off.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a rocky road from here on out, and there were still issues with Brigham Young's succession that needed to be resolved, but Brigham Young himself wrote that he felt the saints were of one heart and one mind after the meeting, that they were united. And so 6 days in August, we get to the end. We find out that the Lord endorses Brigham Young, that the Lord makes his choice, and we move forward from there.
And because of that who, that's going to have a very significant impact on the what of the church going forward.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Church History Matters. And another special thanks to our cameo readers today, Sarah Woodward and Elizabeth Griffiths. Next week, Casey and I discuss how Brigham Young and the 12 led the church for 3 years as a quorum of equals and what then led to the contested decision to ultimately reorganize the first presidency of the church in 1847. If you're enjoying Church History Matters, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate, review, and comment on the podcast. That makes us easier to find. Also, we'd love to hear your suggestions for a future series on this podcast. If there's a church history topic you think would be worth exploring for multiple episodes, send us your idea to podcasts@scripturecentral.org. We'll consider all suggestions. Today's episode was produced by Scott Woodward and edited by Nick Galletti and Scott Woodward, with show notes and transcript by Gabe Davis. Church History Matters is a podcast of Scripture Central, a nonprofit which exists to help build enduring faith in Jesus Christ by making Latter-day Saint scripture and church history accessible, comprehensible, and defensible to people everywhere. For more resources to enhance your gospel study, go to scripturecentral.org, where everything is available for free because of the generous donations of people like you. And while we try very hard to be historically and doctrinally accurate in what we say on this podcast, please remember that all views expressed in this and every episode are our views alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of Scripture Central or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thank you so much for being a part of this with us.